They cut me from the program in plain sight. The microphone asleep under cold fluorescent, the digital clock blinking 7:02 like a metronome for other people's names, while the coordinator in her pressed blazer and plastic badge skimmed her clipboard with a thin, satisfied smile that measured order, not grief. And the young guard planted himself at the tape line as if my worn suit, scuffed shoes, and work-scarred hands were a risk to their polished ceremony. The room smelled of disinfectant and damp wool, elders folded into front-row chairs, eyes drifting away because it's easier. And beside me, my granddaughter's small, steady hand found my elbow, her phone quiet but ready, her gaze catching what their courtesy tried to erase. But in my inside pocket waits an old envelope the color of dry earth, a letter slanted with the dead man's signature, and a single underlined line from their own policy. When I lay paper against paper beneath that sterile light, promise against schedule, this neat machinery will meet the truth he wrote in his own hand, and I will force the room to listen. One request before the next scene: subscribe, comment where you're watching, and share this story. Light spreads when we pass it on. They skipped me in plain sight. The program lay open on the check-in table, names stacked like neat bricks, and the space where my name should have lived was clean as a polished tile. The coordinator with the plastic badge traced a precise finger down the column and stopped on nothing, then aligned the stack as if straight edges could fix what was crooked. Around us, folding chairs hissed against the waxed floor. A hum from the vents washed over the room, and somewhere behind me, a styrofoam cup met a trash can with a hollow click. Cold light flattened the stage and made the silver of the microphone look sterile, like an instrument waiting for the next steady hand. The digital clock above the curtains glowed 7:02, an unblinking witness. I could smell disinfectant from the hallway and the worn wool of winter coats drying in a line along the back wall. The paper in my palm had a different scent entirely, a dry attic smell, fibers older than the scuff marks on these floors. My hand shook once, a tremor more of memory than of age, and I steadied it on the edge of the table. They had printed a program without the name he asked him to put there. The friend we were burying had pressed this letter into my fingers long ago, and I had carried it for years the way men carry talismans, quietly, at the seam between habit and faith. The envelope was thin and brittle at the corners, a brown that had softened toward suede, the flap creased and recreased by a lifetime of ordinary reverence. There was a small smear where my thumb always landed, a fossil of oils that even the best soap could not fully erase. It had weight, not by ounces, but by the patience it had taught me. I eased the envelope open and slid the letter into the light that pooled across the table. The ink had faded to the color of weak tea, but the long, confident strokes of his name still carried the man. How he sloped a line and then lifted it with a small, defiant flourish. Next to it, I laid a single printed page of the auditorium's rules, pulled from their website and marked by me with a pen at the kitchen table. Underlines not of anger, but of accuracy. The section that mattered allowed a pre-designated tribute within the memorial segment when documented ahead of time. I had read it so many times the words lived under my skin like a low hum. The coordinator's pen tapped the clipboard, a metronome of denial. Her badge rattled against his lanyard as she squared her shoulders in a way that made the rules feel like armor. The security guard, young and careful, set his feet in a stance he probably learned from a training slideshow, respectful distance preserved, watching hands and posture, not faces. At the sound console, the stage assistant hovered over a tablet with green bars flickering up and down. He kept the channel for the lectern dark, the small status LED a tidy dot of refusal.
I laid the program flat, then set the letter on top of it so that the signature crossed the printed list like a bridge. The paper rasped under my fingers, and the rasp sounded louder in my own ears than in the room. I could feel the grain of the wooden table through the glossy layer of varnish, and the cool of that varnish traveled up my wrist. People drifted past on their way to seats, nodding the way you nodded grief in public, and their coats left a wet wool smell behind them. Somewhere in the first row, a woman arranged tissue packets at the corner of her purse like a small, anxious offering. I became aware of Maya beside my shoulder before I saw her. The warmth of her coat brushed my sleeve, and then she was there. Low voice, not rising above the sound of vents, steady eyes measuring what sat on the table. She is 17, sharp as a fresh pencil, more patient than her years. She slid into an aisle seat 2 rows back, like someone giving me both space and a net. Her phone held off, screen black, the case scuffed from use, her gaze leaving little fingerprints on every detail that mattered. I felt steadier with her in my periphery, the way a good handrail steadies a staircase you must climb without looking down. The coordinator turned the program so the type faced her again, as if the type could answer for the omission. A sign at the end of the table declared that sign-ups had closed at 6:45. I had seen it when I walked in, black letters on a clean sheet in a clear stand. It had not changed the sentence of the rules I carried, only the angle from which I would have to read them out loud. The guard's radio whispered to itself, a private language of clicks and coded breath, and soft shoes squeaked as latecomers slid into the back row. I gathered the letter and the policy sheet in one hand, edge aligned, corners tidy, then set the pair down again in clear view. The act calmed me the way straightening a frame calms a hallway. I did not speak. I let the objects do what they could do. A name signed by the deceased, a policy drafted by the living. I felt the old ache in my knuckles, the kind that wakes when the air pressure shifts, and found that it steadied my grip more than it weakened it. Grief is like that. It can tighten your hold. The microphone stood a measured number of steps away, as reachable as a water glass placed just out of habit beyond the edge of a placemat. The stage assistant looked down the length of his arm at the tablet, then up at the lectern, then back at me with the impersonal focus of a man whose value is measured in seconds saved. Somewhere behind the curtains, someone adjusted a stand. The metal collar scraped, and the sound rang like a small alarm. I could hear, under all of it, the low, constant heartbeat of the HVAC, the mechanical mercy that keeps air moving when people forget to breathe. I pointed to the passage on my printed page without touching the coordinator's clipboard. My finger stopped over the line that had earned a narrow rectangle of yellow highlighter earlier in the afternoon, the provision for a pre-designated tribute within the memorial block when documented prior. The page had 3 staple holes at the top left from where I had misfired the stapler, and I had left them because a true thing does not need to be pretty to be true. Her eyes followed the shape of my finger, then flicked back to the rigid grid of her schedule. A row of elders sat hip to hip in the front, coats folded on their laps, a small collection of quiet authority. They were the sort of people who built the walls of this place one fundraise at a time and never asked for their names to be carved into them. I felt them noticing the envelope and the letter, not with noise, but with a lifting of chins, a way of holding still that means attention in old bodies. The clock ticked 1 minute forward. The program crackled as someone else picked up a copy. The room made the small, constant sounds of decorum.
I thought of him, of the man in the soil tonight, and of the afternoon he told me to keep his letter like a key. I had not expected to need it in this exact shape, in this exact light, but that did not make it less itself. The letter had moved with me through apartments and hospitals and a quiet house after my wife left the world. It had waited like a folded hand, like a bench at the end of a long walk. It was not law. It was a promise. The rules could meet a promise halfway if someone took the trouble to hold them still long enough to see the hinge. I took one small step toward the lectern and stopped where the inventory of the room required me to stop, just shy of the tape line the assistant had placed earlier to keep the throat of the aisle clear. The guard watched but did not shift. The coordinator lifted her pen again as if to write a note that would make the air less dense. Maya's phone remained quiet in her lap, her attention nothing like a push, everything like a hand ready under my elbow if I needed to feel the distance shorten in a way no one else would see. What betrayed me tonight was not some villain's face. It was a blank where a line should have been. I had felt worse cuts. The blank stung because it was clean. In a place made for community, a clean blank can feel as sharp as a slap. I let the sting teach me how to stand here with the paper, not to fight the table, but to hold it to its own language. The letter sang its soft old note. The policy offered its thin, administrative chord. Together they made a tune that did not please the clock, but did not offend it either. Ozone from the sound system pricked the back of my throat when the assistant tested a side channel for the slideshow they would run later. Dust floated through the light above the aisle, and in that dust I saw the years I had waited to do simple things the right way, not because it was easy, but because it lasted longer. Above the stage, the digital numbers hardened into 703. The plan for the next speaker lay on the clipboard like a sealed door. I set my palm flat on the varnish, feeling the cool perfectly through the old nerves, and chose to lift the letter 1 inch higher. I raised the envelope and the paper together until the signature met the level of my chest, and as the small bulb on the microphone snapped from dark to ready, the coordinator's hand cut the air between us like a gate coming down. Her hand stayed up like a stop sign, wrist rigid, fingers together, the palm a bright oval in the cold light. The tiny bulb on the microphone kept its clean glow, indifferent to her gesture, indifferent to me. For a beat, I could hear the vents, the cramped whir of the projector fan, the soft complaint of a chair leg scraping across the floor as someone adjusted their knees. The scent of disinfectant lifted again, sharp at the edge of my tongue. I lowered nothing. I let the paper hover at my chest as if the signature could breathe on its own. The coordinator's pen came down on the clipboard with a tap that felt practiced. She didn't look at me. She looked at the grid she knew would protect her. The stage assistant glanced between the tablet and the lectern and made a small motion at his throat that said the channel could be ready and still mean nothing. The security guard took half a step along an invisible line and set his feet again, a careful choreography of presence without contact. My documents lay in a neat square order on the table, and my body stood just shy of the tape line the assistant had pressed onto the floor earlier with his shoe. I have known this kind of refusal in different rooms. It travels without needing a mouth. It points to a schedule and calls it truth. It offers patience like a test instead of a courtesy. The program's paper felt coated and sleek under my thumb. The policy sheet had the slightly grainy texture of home printing. The black letters a little heavy where my old printer liked to flood the edges. I slid the policy closer to the clipboard, so the paragraph that mattered sat side by side with her tidy list of names, 2 languages that ought to touch. Beside me, Maya rose from the aisle seat and adjusted her coat. Not fast, not loud. She moved like the room was water, and she was choosing a way through it that would not leave a wake.
The soft rubber on her phone case brushed the varnish as she held the lens level with the printed rules, then eased it up to catch the digital clock in the same frame. I could smell a hint of citrus from the gum she tucked in her cheek, clean and familiar against the institutional air. Her presence steadied a part of me nothing else could reach, not because she could change this moment, but because she could keep it from being erased. The coordinator turned a page on the clipboard as if a fresh sheet could offer a better answer. She tapped a line and traced the narrow rectangle with the tip of her pen, a box drawn around the next scheduled speaker. The assistant nodded, eyes returning to the tablet, the green bars pulsing like a patient heartbeat. The guard shifted his weight again and let his radio exhale a coded whisper. The sound of it landed on me like a hand on my shoulder that did not belong there, polite but proprietorial. I made a small adjustment that mattered only to me, squared the corners of the letter and the policy, set them so the signature fell exactly under the sentence that allowed my standing. The envelope's paper was fragile at the seam, soft from years of being opened and closed during long nights when I missed my wife's voice. The justified margins of the policy paragraph looked stiff against the lupin angle of my friend's name. Paper knows things about time that voices forget. It remembers when someone asked something of you and wrote it down so neither of you would have to wrestle memories on a hard day. From the front row came a rustle that was not a protest and not a sigh, only a collective settling that said, "Attention." Those elders, coats folded, spines willing to hold witness a little longer than comfort, lifted their chins together. One reached for her glasses, slid them down her nose, and left them there half-masked, which is the posture of scrutiny in a certain generation. They did not speak. They made shape in the air that allowed my papers to be more than a personal ache. The program at the far edge of the table shifted when the coordinator pulled it toward herself, and the letter's corners slid an inch. I put it back. That simple movement felt like naming something in a language I wasn't supposed to know. Maya caught it with the camera. She stepped to the side without crossing any tape, the small muscles in her jaw quieting as she found the angle that would hold the clock, the policy paragraph, the envelope, and my hand in one shot. She did this not to break a rule, but to show the rule the mirror it refused to stand in. The assistant breathed out through his nose, a little flare, the way someone does when they see their plan shifting grain by grain. He glanced at the coordinator's hand and then at the tablet. The LEDs arranged themselves into a new pattern. He reset the timer for the next scheduled tribute, although no tribute had yet begun. That sound, a soft chime, almost apologetic, reached me like a pulse of cold water. Time has a way of siding with whoever holds the button that starts it. Maya's knee brushed my calf as she stepped closer and angled the phone to include the timer's zeros waiting to become something. I remembered her as a small child, legs swinging from a chair too tall for her, counting the red numbers on a microwave because counting was a way to make waiting less cruel. Now she wasn't counting for herself. She was making a record that would not be erased by polite rearrangements. There was such steadiness in a 17-year-old choosing to enter this choreography without needing to dominate it. The guard's cologne moved with him, a clean, sharp smell that tried too hard to be neutral. He positioned himself not quite behind me, not quite beside me. The geometry a message. We are watching you, and we are not doing anything wrong. The badge on his chest shuffled against his jacket with each shift. He kept his hands where everyone could see them, because visibility can be both a comfort and a warning. I felt the sting of it in a place that had been stung before.
The coordinator finally looked at the policy page instead of through it. Her eyes tracked my underlines, the yellowed rectangle round the one provision that mattered. She didn't touch the paper. She might as well have held it at arm's length without moving her arms. She turned and looked toward the back of the room. It was the look a person gives when they want the air itself to tell them what to do next, so that whatever they do can be framed as obedience rather than choice. From the far aisle, a man in a city badge walked with a file folder against his ribs and a lanyard that had seen too many years of fluorescent light. His shoes made a muted sound, rubber on floor, deliberate, domestic. His tie had a crease line down the middle as if it had been folded into itself for too long. He took in the posted sign about sign-ups, the line at the bottom of my printed policy, the small ecosystem we had built out of paper and need. He didn't hurry. He didn't dawdle. He moved with the kind of pace that respects both gravity and procedure. His approach pulled a visible thread through the front rows, heads angled to track him. The assistant's mouth tightened and then smoothed. The guard's radio clicked once, then went quiet like a held breath. The coordinator shifted her stance and lowered the pen. Maya slid half a step, a little arc to include him in her frame without losing the clock. My palms were damp now, and I felt the varnish cool under them in a way that sharpened my sense of everything I was touching: paper, wood, air, expectation. He stopped at the tape line, looked at the lectern, at the clock, at my documents, then at me. There was no contempt in his face, but there was a practiced caution, the sort people who stay in municipal work have when they have learned that decisions get quoted back to them. He took in the yellowed edge of the envelope, the slanted name, the printed paragraph with its unromantic verbs. He traced the distance between the clock and the policy in his head. He lifted a finger toward the assistant in a small open palm gesture that did not command so much as request that nothing be toggled until eyes had done their work. Humiliations gather their own gravity. They don't need to be loud. They accrete through small, stony movements. A page turned toward a person instead of toward a principle. A timer advanced because it can be. A pen that boxes a future and pretends the present is already past. Each one landed and stayed. I could feel them on my shoulders, on my jaw, on the old nick of a scar near my left wrist from a much younger man's job. They ask you to believe you are asking too much when all you are doing is holding a piece of paper in the light. Maya's presence pushed against that gravity. She made a quiet space where my age did not make me smaller. Her phone captured the way the clock's colon blinked, the way my thumb rested on the margin, the way the envelope's flap had been mended with a strip of transparent tape at some point in the past. She anchored her feet like a dancer who knows where the floor ends. She breathed through her nose and kept the lens steady, even when her heart must have been doing something noisy. The city badge man nodded once to himself. Not to me, not to the coordinator, not to the room, just to the fact of what lay in front of us. He adjusted his folder, and in that small movement I recognized a person who understood that paper is not decoration. He positioned his body so he could receive rather than take. The clock ticked another minute. The projector fan hummed a steady white thread that held the air together. Someone in the back coughed into a sleeve and then went still. The coordinator shifted the clipboard closer to the edge, as if giving up a little ground she'd never believe she ceded. The assistant licked his lips and stared at the tablet, as if a number might change itself. The guard's eyes touched my hands and then settled somewhere a foot above my shoulder, a conscious decision to look at something that could not be a problem. I lifted the letter that last half inch so the signature was clear over the policy line. I did not speak. I did not move my feet. I gave the room the dignity of time because I knew what dignity feels like when someone steals it.
The man from City Hall extended his open hand toward the envelope. I slid the envelope until it pressed into his palm and left the letter visible. the flap brushing his skin with a soft drag only old paper makes. The brown edge looked almost suede under the fluorescent wash. He took the weight with the care you give a family photograph, not light, not careless, and lifted the sheet by its corners so the signature could catch the cold light without glare. My thumb, freed of its long post, tingled with blood returning. He read with that municipal patience that never hurries and never stops. His eyes went from the slanted name to the date, then down to the sentence where my friend had written mine, full length, no nickname, the way you referred to a person when you want no confusion later. He let his attention rest on the line endings, on the steady pressure of a pen that belonged to a man who made decisions, then set the letter a half-inch above the program so the two did not touch. He did not ask for the policy sheet. He waited for me to offer it, and I did, sliding it beside the letter in a square that felt like a small room within the larger one. He did not sit. He did not step back. He stood with the paper and the policy between us like a table we had built together out of need. The coordinator adjusted her clipboard a few degrees, angling it so the overhead reflection made it harder for me to see the lines. The stage assistant's tablet threw a greenish glow across his cheekbones as bars flexed up and down. The guard's breath pressed against my shoulder blade without touching it, one human body measuring another in a language made of angles. The digital clock refused to blink faster or slower just because our hearts did. Maya shifted her stance to my left and framed the papers and the clock in one line. Her boots made no sound on the varnished floor. I could smell again that clean citrus from her gum, a small, ordinary anchor that cut through the metallic edge of ozone from the sound system. She moved the phone closer, by inches, slow enough to respect the bodies around her, sure enough that no one could mistake the act for intrusion. Her presence worked on me like a steady hand on a shoulder that knows your bones better than you do. I traced the underlines on my copy with a finger I kept a hair above the paper, as if heat alone could point. Pre-designated tribute within the memorial segment when documented prior. Adjustments recorded in the event log. No mention of erasing a name to make room for another. No clause that asked me to be smaller than the paper I held. The policy's toner left a faint, dusty smell on the air the way it always does when a page has been through a home printer too many times. It made me think of my kitchen table at 4 in the afternoon, light falling across the laminate, the click of the stapler misfiring, me lining the edges up because alignment gave me a kind of breath. He leaned closer, his tie brushing the edge of the table with a dry whisper. With 2 fingers, he compared the printed headers on my policy to the sign across the table where they had posted their cutoff time, not pitting one against the other so much as seeing how they intersected. He set the policy down and lifted the envelope by its corner. You could see where I had mended the flap with clear tape sometime during a different winter. That little seam caught the light like a healed scar catches straw sunlight in a late afternoon. Humiliations kept accumulating in the space between these movements. The coordinator's pen hovered, ready to make a box around the next name whether a mouth spoke or not. The assistant tapped a screen to check a volume that had not needed checking until I stood here. The guard rolled his shoulders forward and back as if he had practiced that exact relaxation against an imagined complaint. A young man near the back leaned sideways to whisper into a friend's ear and left the sentence hanging in the air because saying something half-hidden is another way of pressing someone down. I let my mind rest for a breath on the years I had carried this envelope through other rooms no body marked down. Hospital waiting areas with coffee that tasted like pennies. An office with carpet so new it gave off a sweetness that turned your stomach. A living room with pictures taken off the walls because grief made us not want to see ourselves. The paper had lived with me like a small compass. It had not made me any promises. It had kept me close to one. The memory steadied the tremor in my fingers the way a good railing steadies a staircase you do not want to fall down. Maya tilted her phone to catch the blinking colon of the clock. She focused tight enough that the dust caught in the light looked like a slow snow. Her breath was audible to me and probably to no one else. The smallest tide keeping time with a machine. I felt the gratitude the old feel when the young choose to stand in a complicated room and do the simple thing well. Her attention said this mattered, not because I was old, but because a paper made a promise that should be met by a policy. He placed his file folder on the table, slid the letter onto it to give the old paper a smoother back, then set his finger gently on the policy clause I had underlined. He kept his finger there long enough to make the room aware of where truth lay for this moment. He did not speak, and I was thankful for that. Words would have been a shortcut. Silence allowed the weight of the sentence to travel through everyone's bones in its own time, including mine. My pulse slowed just enough for me to feel the layer of wax on the table through the skin of my palm. This was the point where I made my choice. Not the choice between anger and patience. I had made that earlier when I brought the policy and the letter instead of a story empty of proof. This was the choice of how to fit the truth into the machinery without breaking gears that would grind me up just because they had been jarred. I set my free hand on the program, pressed the edge lightly, and pictured the block of memorial time as a field we could replant without tearing up the fence. I could read the letter aloud as foundation, not performance. They could record in the event log that a pre-designated tribute had been honored without lengthening the total segment. The people already printed in the program would not lose their place. The machine would not have to call my dignity a threat to clean lines. I imagined the columns in the logbook, the way an intern or a clerk would write. Adjustment noted, documentation reviewed, time redistributed within block. I pictured my friend's name appearing there as it had appeared on the letter, the ink steadying into a public line that would outlast my breath. I did not imagine applause or a sweeping gesture. My mind stayed in the little box of this table, in the rectangle made by paper, in the odor of toner and wood polish and wool coats going dry. More small humiliations gathered their pebbles at my feet. The coordinator set the clipboard down with its metal clip facing me like a jaw. The assistant made a show of reorganizing his notes, as if I had appealed to something other than a page he could see. A young staffer at the doorway pushed the sign-up placard half an inch closer to the edge of the table so its edges lined up neat, and I felt the message move under that tidy motion like a snake under grass. It all added up to a pressure that asked me to step back from the line I had been told to respect. I did not step back. I did not break the tape with my toes either. I stood where a man stands when he intends to keep faith with the living and the dead at the same time. Maya's shoulder warmed the air by my elbow. I could feel the little heat of her against the steady artificial cold running out of the ceiling. The elders in the first row did not move, and that stillness was the loudest sound in the room, if you knew how to listen.
He lifted his eyes to mine and then to the clock. He touched the edge of the tablet with two knuckles, a gesture that did not belong to command so much as to choreography. The assistant's eyebrows rose, then settled. The coordinator's mouth shaped itself into something neutral and professional. The guard relaxed his jaw. I placed the letter flat again on the folder and kept my hand open near the bottom edge like a man prepared to hold an instrument steady. I saw the shape of the path. Letter as foundation, policy as gate,
Time redistributed within the same block. Name preserved in the log. No one erased. The vision was not a fantasy. It was what the words permitted if someone cared as much about meaning as about grids. I did not let myself step into the next room in my head. I held this room, this second, this breath. The projector fan hummed. The colon on the clock blinked. The gum in Maya's mouth had lost most of its citrus. The varnish under my palm had warmed to my skin. The coordinator slid the clipboard 2 inches to her right, squared her feet, and with a motion so small it would not show up on a theater camera, she nudged the microphone pedestal a palm's breadth toward me, while the man from City Hall pointed at the waiting timer. If this moment speaks to you, like it, comment your view and share. Each click invites another witness. The pedestal stopped with its rubber foot nudging the tape, and the man from City Hall's finger hung a breath over the timer before lowering to his side. The channel on the tablet brightened to life, a small square shifting from idle to ready, and the assistant's shoulders released a fraction of their grip on his neck. The coordinator adjusted the clipboard so that the metal clip faced away from me, then drew a quick line in the margin, a private code that would make sense later to anyone who traced this moment back through paper. The guard eased a half step to his original post and let his hands settle where hands go when they intend to be seen and not to act. I did not step forward. I let the objects finish speaking first. The man from City Hall set his folder under the letter to give it a cleaner back, then tapped the policy clause with his knuckle in a way that asked the room to look without making anyone perform the act of looking. The posted sign about sign-ups stayed where it was, but its edge no longer cut at the same angle. The digital clock above the curtains glowed a steady minute, unthreatened by what we were doing beneath it. There are times when a machine's indifference feels like mercy. Maya shifted beside me without a sound. She framed the folder, the letter, the policy, the clipboard, the timer, and the small glow on the tablet in one calm shot. The citrus on her breath had faded, replaced by the cotton smell of her scarf warming against her skin. The gentleness of that smell reached me more deeply than the disinfectant ever could, the way ordinary tenderness does in a room full of rules. She was not asking the room for anything. She was catching it in the act of being itself. The elders in the first row lifted their chins together by a fraction, a motion that felt like the slow closing of a book that has been read carefully. One set her glasses back on the bridge of her nose, no longer at half-mast. Another pressed her hand to the program on her lap and smoothed it once as if to quiet a wrinkle that did not exist. Their stillness moved from tension to attention, and that shift gave my bones a little more space under my coat. The assistant, with the automatic care of someone protecting the shape of his work, ran his fingertip along a row of sliders and checked the lectern's cable at the base. The metal collar caught the light and threw it toward the floor in a pale band that stopped at the tape line. He reset the timer not to punish or erase, but to start a count that matched the shape we had agreed the moment would take. The small chime sounded again, less like a rebuke and more like a breath being given back.
The coordinator wrote. I did not read her handwriting, but I recognized the discipline of it. The narrow letters, the even pressure, the ink that did not blot. She placed a small dot next to the line for the memorial segment and drew an arrow that curved back into the same box, not out of it. That arrow mattered. It said change without trespass. She slid the clipboard 2 inches toward the man from City Hall, and he placed his open palm on its corner, like a seal without a ring. I lifted the letter from the folder with care that acknowledged both its age and its purpose. The paper rasped at the edge where it had been folded and unfolded across years. I could smell a little of the box it had lived in, the dry sweetness of old cardboard and a trace of the starch from a shirt I had been wearing the day I tucked the envelope inside the folder before leaving the house. I did not hold it up like a trophy. I held it like an instrument I knew how to play in a room that had finally admitted music belonged here. The man from City Hall gave a small nod that did not carry like a signal. It was an internal nod that happened to be visible. The assistant lifted his eyes to the lectern and then to me. He did not need to tell me anything. The air told me. I set the policy flat beside the letter so the underlined line and the signature made a gentle cross, two lines that had found each other without any need for force. The varnish under my palm was no longer cold. It had warmed to the temperature of my skin. I read the letter to the room without quoting it with my mouth. I read it with the order of my hands, with the way I steadied the paper and let my eyes travel down the familiar lines. The man who had written it sat with me in that movement. His slant and flourish manifested in each small tilt of my wrist. The content was simple, a request, a designation, a trust that did not need decoration. I let the room watch me honor that simplicity, because watching is part of how a community learns to believe a thing is true. The policy did its part without noise. It stood there, printed in the modest ink of a home office, and made its plain offer. Within this segment, with prior documentation, a tribute may be included and recorded in the event log. I placed my finger a hair above that sentence and held it there long enough for the assistant to see, for the coordinator to see, for the eldest to see, for Maya to anchor in her frame. The man from City Hall set his pen on the clipboard, clicked it once, and wrote a line in the margins of a form that looked like a log. He did not perform the writing for us. He wrote because the act needed to exist. The small subplots that had been strung around us found their endings. The sign-up placard remained, but it no longer functioned as a blade. It was a notice, doing what notices do when context holds. The guard returned to the place where the geometry of courtesy lives, his cologne settling into a background that no longer pressed on my skin. The assistant's posture lost that tightness men get when they fear that one variance will be read as failure. The coordinator's pen lay down next to a clipboard in a way that meant a decision had been entered, not just imagined. Maya lowered the phone a few inches and drew a breath I could hear. She didn't stop recording. She changed the angle to include more faces and less paper. It made sense. We were moving from the proof of a promise to the people who would hold it, and she understood that without anyone saying it aloud. I felt the brief ache where grief and pride meet, a spot just under the sternum where heat collects when you realize someone you love has chosen to stand where the air is thin on your behalf and has done it with grace.
I picked up the program I had set aside earlier and placed it below the letter, not to cover anything, but to show how these pages could live together. Program, policy, letter, public plan, rule, promise. I aligned corners without fuss. Alignment has always calmed me, not because I worship order, but because straight lines give mercy to tired eyes. The elders' hands rested on their laps and their fingers unclenched. One nodded. The nod did not travel outward into applause. It settled like a pebble reaching the bottom of a clear pond. The assistant faced the tablet and brought the lectern channel up to a level that would carry a human voice without forcing it to compete with air. His movements were gentle. He did not aim to impress. He aimed to match the room's true size. The tiny ready light on the microphone stayed steady. The stutter it had held all night forgot itself. The timer waited at zeros that did not threaten. The projector fan hummed the same quiet thread it had been humming, only now it felt like part of a song instead of a noise we were trying to ignore. The man from City Hall turned the log form so that it faced him, drew a short line where a witness would sign later, and placed a small check mark next to a field whose label I could not read from where I stood. He lifted his pen and tapped the page once, as if reminding himself to follow this line back later for whatever report must be filed in the days ahead. He returned the pen to his pocket, not because the work was over, but because this piece of it was now stable enough to hold its own weight. I pressed my palm flat on the table and felt the faint tackiness where a spill long ago had left a memory in the varnish. The sensation grounded me more than any words could have. I lifted the letter and slid it back into the envelope with the care you give a photograph at the end of a visit, not to hide it, but to acknowledge that its work tonight was shifting from proof to presence. The envelope kept its shape. The clear tape across the flap glinted once, then went quiet. I closed the folder over the policy and the program and placed my fingertips lightly along its spine. The room had found a shape that could carry the next few minutes without tearing anyone. The sign on the table still said what it said. The clock still marked time in clean, even numbers. The stage assistant still watched his bars. The coordinator still held her clipboard. The guard still kept the line. The elders still sat in their front row humility. Maya still stood with the lens, catching more truth than any of us could hold in our hands alone. I wrapped my fingers around the microphone and felt the weight settle into my palm like a familiar tool, not a weapon, not a prize. The channel was steady. The timer waited. The folder rested open on the table, spine aligned, pages quiet. I drew a breath that tasted of dust, polish, wool, and a strand of citrus that hadn't completely left the air. I let the breath out and felt the room let one out with me. Nothing had been resolved, much had been prepared. The space in front of me was clear, and the path between what was promised and what needed to be said was finally, simply open. I lifted the microphone and felt the mesh cool against my knuckles. The timer bloomed into numbers, clean and impartial, and the lectern transmitted a small tremor from the building's ventilation into my fingertips. The room quieted not by command, but by gravity. I drew the letter from the envelope one last time and let its edges square themselves on the folder. The policy lay open beside it, like a door already unlocked. I began by naming the paper for what it was, a designation written by the man we were burying, dated and signed in the hand everyone who knew him would recognize. I did not perform it. I held the sheet steady and let the lines travel through my voice the way a river follows its bed. The strokes of his name carried the sound of his decisions into this cold light. The first row leaned forward by a breath. Maya's lens steadied on the page, then on me, then on the clock that kept us honest.
I told the room with the letter required that I offer a tribute within the memorial segment. The policy's small sentence met that requirement without drama. I pressed the finger a hair above the clause and let the space between paper and skin complete the circle. The man from City Hall stood where he could see both documents and the timer. The stage assistant, who had been the keeper of seconds all evening, set his jaw into a new shape that looked like acceptance. The coordinator's pen laid down the first of several lines in the event log, careful and even. I turned from proof to memory without leaving the structure we had built. I spoke of my friend in the present tense that grief allows when love refuses to let a person vanish all at once. I named the quiet work he did in basements and back rooms. I sketched the way his laughter had corners, even when joy was street. I folded in the small history he wrote into me when he pressed this letter into my hands long ago and asked me to carry it, not as leverage, but as a promise to be used with care. My voice stayed within the room's size. The microphone made no fuss of it,
just carried breath into space where breath had been refused. The elders gave me their stillness as a kind of blessing. In their silence, I heard the echo of potlucks, board votes, mopped floors, chairs folded and unfolded, all the ordinary ceremonies that tell a community it exists between big moments. The god's geometry softened by degrees until he was simply a man standing with others in a room that had finally chosen to be fair. The assistant watched the bars on his tablet and let them do their simple work. The coordinator's shoulders unhooked from her ears. The man from City Hall wrote what needed to be written and never looked away from the facts of the page. I kept one hand on the letter and the other on the lectern, and I walked the room through the few pieces of my friend that could stand inside a short, honest time. I brought back the way he organized a coat drive with no budget and a stack of index cards. I told how he corrected me gently years ago when I almost let form replace meaning. How he taught me that rules are best when they protect the very thing they measure. I did not embellish. I let the details breathe. The timer's numbers felt less like a blade now and more like a metronome. When I reached the end of the letter, I placed it flat beside the policy so the signature could rest under the clause that had made room for it. The room saw those two lines cross. The crossing did not break anything. It held. The coordinator's hand hovered over the log, then recorded the notation that the pre-designated tribute had been included within the segment. She added a brief corrective to the program with a pen, not to pretend the omission had never happened, but to show that it had been answered in the open. The city badge man shifted to the lectern side and addressed the room in the formal language of procedure without reaching for pump. He acknowledged the letter and the clause and indicated that the log would reflect the adjustment and the reason for it. He stated that staff would be reminded before the next event began how the policy applies to the memorial block when documentation exists. He kept his voice steady and his body small, a professional making a record. It felt like a window opening. The coordinator, owning the part she could own, lifted the clipboard and spoke to the assembly in the practical tone she likely used every day. She recognized the omission and affirmed that where documentation pre-exists, the door remains open inside the schedule. She pointed to the log and the policy and to the posted sign, whose meaning had narrowed back to its proper size tonight. She did not ask to be excused. She asked the room to see the correction. That is also a kind of service.
The assistant, who'd been guarding the timing with his shoulders, adjusted the run sheet with a pencil and drew a small looped arrow that returned time to the same box instead of stealing it from another. He checked the level on the microphone with a gentleness he had not shown earlier, the kind of care men offer when they remember that their tools are meant to help people and not to keep them out. The guard stepped back into the simple rectangle of his post, hands open, eyes soft. He was not the story and did not need to try to be. I finished the tribute to my friend with an ordinary thanks for the room's attention and a sentence that belonged to him, not as a quotation anyone could pin to a plaque, but as a way he carried himself in the world. I let that sentence set a second on the air until the clock's colon blinked once. The response was not applause. It was the rustle of bodies settling into recognition and the soft collective sound a room makes when it relaxes into what is right. The journalist from the weekly paper, who'd been quiet near the door, took one last frame that caught the letter and the policy side by side with the digital clock above them and the log where the correction lived. She lowered her camera the way someone lowers their hands after prayer, gently,
with the awareness that a moment has closed and should stay closed. Maya stopped recording and slipped her phone into her coat, then wrapped her fingers around my wrist for a measured second that warmed the old bones and told them they had done their work. Consequences settled into place without spectacle. The coordinator placed a temporary notice on the table, reminding staff and guests in plain language that pre-designated tributes will be honored within the memorial block upon presentation of documentation. The man from City Hall added a notation that immediate guidance had been given and that a brief refresher would be conducted for volunteers before the next service began. The assistant updated his checklist with a new line about verifying documentation in hand when the program is printed. The guard adjusted the placement of the sign so that it no longer projected refusal beyond its true scope. I folded the letter back into its envelope and slid the envelope into the folder. The tape at the flap caught a line of light and then let it go. I placed the policy above it and the corrected program on top, a neat stack I could carry with one steady hand. I stood for a moment with my palm on the folder and felt the varnish's faint tack where some long ago spilled had left a memory. The air smelled like wool and dust and the lemon of someone's hand cream. The building hummed with the quiet of a job continuing after it has been set back on its rails. Peace arrived not as triumph, but as alignment. My friend's name rested where it needed to rest. The rule did the work it was written to do. The people charged with keeping the doors opened them in view of the very people those doors are meant to shelter. My body, which had braced for the small shocks of 100 tiny refusals, loosened the muscles it uses to survive and remembered the ones it uses to belong. Maya's hand left my wrist, but the warmth remained. I stepped away from the lectern and let the next part of the evening begin as it had always needed to begin, with a program that could finally hold the weight placed upon it. I took my seat and felt the chair welcome me the way a familiar threshold welcomes a foot that has walked a long road without leaving the block. In that settling, I understood what we had done together. We had made form serve meaning in public, where it is hardest and most necessary. When a promise is written and a policy is honest, the door opens. Let the city learn to keep it that way.